The year was 1944, and the world was tearing itself apart. In the midst of this chaos, in a small convent tucked away in the French countryside, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Something that would challenge everything you think you know about love, duty, and the impossible choices we make when our hearts collide with history. What I'm about to share with you is a story that artificial intelligence has brought to life, but it's rooted in the very real experiences of countless individuals who lived through the darkest chapter of human history. This isn't just another war story. This is a tale of forbidden love that bloomed in the shadows of occupation, where a single glance could mean the difference between life and death. You might be wondering how such a story could even exist. How could love possibly survive in a world consumed by hatred? How could two people from opposite sides of an unforgivable conflict find each other? And perhaps most importantly, what would you do if you were forced to choose between your deepest convictions and your heart's greatest desire? By the end of this series, you'll have witnessed one of the most emotionally devastating love stories ever told. You'll understand why some secrets are worth keeping, even when they threaten to destroy everything you hold sacred. But before we dive into this heart-wrenching tale, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might realize. This narrative was created using advanced artificial intelligence trained on thousands of historical accounts, personal letters, and documented experiences from World War II. The AI didn't just generate random dialogue, it studied the patterns of human emotion under extreme duress, the psychology of forbidden relationships, and the incredible capacity for love to flourish, even in humanity's darkest moments. What makes this story particularly powerful is how it captures the authentic voice and emotional truth of people who lived through impossible circumstances. Every word of dialogue, every stolen glance, every moment of agonizing decision has been crafted to honor the memory of those who faced similar choices during the war. So settle in, because what you're about to experience will challenge everything you think you know about good and evil, about love and sacrifice, about the thin line between survival and betrayal. This is the story of Sister Margaret and Officer Hans Muller, and how their forbidden romance would test the very foundations of faith, duty, and human decency. The convent of St. Catherine sat like a forgotten prayer among the rolling hills of Normandy. Its ancient stone walls had witnessed centuries of devotion, but never anything quite like what was about to unfold within them. The year was 1944, and the German occupation had transformed even the most sacred places into potential battlegrounds. Sister Margaret had dedicated her life to serving God and healing the wounded. At 28 years old, she possessed a quiet strength that drew people to her like moths to candlelight. Her hands, calloused from years of tending to the sick, carried a gentleness that could soothe even the most tormented souls. She had taken her vows 7 years earlier, believing that her path was clear and unwavering. But war has a way of rewriting even the most carefully planned destinies. The morning everything changed started like any other. Sister Margaret was tending to patients in the makeshift infirmary that the convent had become. Wounded soldiers from both sides found their way to these sacred halls because pain recognizes no uniform, no flag, no political allegiance. The sisters had made a sacred promise to treat anyone who came seeking help, regardless of which army they served. The sound of approaching vehicles shattered the morning silence. Heavy boots echoed through the corridors as German officers arrived for what had become a routine inspection. These visits always filled the convent with tension, but they had learned to endure them with quiet dignity. That was when Officer Hans Muller first walked through those ancient doors. Hans was not what anyone would expect from a Nazi officer. At 32, he carried himself with a weariness that spoke of too many battles, too many orders he wished he had never received. His uniform marked him as the enemy, but his eyes told a different story entirely. They held a sadness that seemed to reach back through generations of sorrow. He had been conscripted into service 3 years earlier, pulled away from his studies in philosophy and literature at the University of Heidelberg. Before the war, he had dreamed of becoming a teacher, of sharing his love of poetry and human understanding with young minds eager to learn. Instead, he found himself wearing the uniform of a regime he secretly despised. The moment their eyes met across that crowded infirmary, something shifted in the very fabric of reality. It wasn't the dramatic, cinematic moment you might expect. It was quieter than that, more dangerous. It was the kind of recognition that happens between souls, the kind that transcends uniforms and vows and all the artificial barriers that humans create to separate themselves from one another. Sister Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. She had tended to dozens of German soldiers over the past 2 years, had looked into their eyes with professional compassion and Christian charity. But this was different. This was seeing another human being in all their complexity and contradiction, seeing past the uniform to the man who wore it with obvious reluctance. Hans felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had trained himself to see enemies everywhere, to maintain the emotional distance necessary for survival in wartime. But looking at this young nun, with her serene face and knowing eyes, he felt something he had thought was dead inside him stir back to life. Neither of them spoke during that first encounter. What could they possibly say? The gulf between them seemed insurmountable. She was a bride of Christ, devoted to peace and healing. He was a soldier in an army of occupation, sworn to orders that often contradicted everything he believed about human decency. But sometimes, the most profound connections are formed not through words, but through the silent recognition of shared humanity. In that moment, they both understood that something irreversible had just occurred, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and their place in the world. The inspection continued around them as if nothing had happened. Hans performed his duties with mechanical precision, checking the patient registers, ensuring that the convent was complying with German regulations. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying that moment of connection over and over again. Sister Margaret returned to her patients, her hands steady as always, but her heart racing with an emotion she couldn't name and didn't dare acknowledge. She had dedicated her life to serving God, to remaining pure and untouched by worldly desires. But what she had just experienced felt anything but worldly. It felt like a recognition of something sacred, something that transcended all the categories and boundaries she had built her life around. Over the following weeks, the inspections became more frequent. Hans found reasons to return to the convent, always maintaining the pretense of official duty. He would walk through the infirmary, observing the sisters at work, but his attention was always drawn to one particular figure moving quietly among the wounded. Sister Margaret began to anticipate these visits with an emotion that both thrilled and terrified her. She would catch herself listening for the sound of his footsteps, watching for his tall figure to appear in the doorway. When their eyes met, which happened with increasing frequency, she felt a jolt of electricity that seemed to illuminate parts of herself she had never known existed. They began to exchange small gestures of acknowledgement. A slight nod when he entered the room, a gentle smile when she passed him in the corridor. These tiny moments became precious to both of them, stolen seconds of connection in a world that demanded they remain strangers. But in wartime, even the smallest acts of human recognition can become dangerous. Other sisters began to notice Sister Margaret's distraction during prayers. Fellow officers questioned Hans about his frequent visits to the convent. The weight of their secret, barely acknowledged even to themselves, began to press down upon them both. The turning point came on a rain-soaked evening in late October. A badly wounded German soldier had been brought to the convent, delirious with fever and calling out for his mother. Sister Margaret worked tirelessly through the night, trying to save his life, but it was clear that he was dying. Hans arrived just as the young soldier drew his final breath. He had come to check on one of his men, but instead found himself witnessing something profound. Sister Margaret knelt beside the bed holding the dead boy's hand. tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers for his soul. In that moment, Hans saw her not as a symbol or a representative of her faith, but as a woman of extraordinary compassion who grieved for every life lost, regardless of which side they had fought for. And Sister Margaret, looking up to find Hans standing in the doorway with his own tears barely held in check, saw not an enemy soldier, but a man whose heart was breaking for the same reasons as hers. That night, standing in the presence of death and surrounded by the ancient stones that had witnessed countless human struggles, they both understood that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They had seen each other's souls, and in doing so had discovered something that would change the course of both their lives forever. The weeks that followed that pivotal night became a carefully choreographed dance of stolen moments and unspoken words. Hans found himself inventing increasingly elaborate reasons to visit the convent. Supply checks that had once been perfunctory now stretched into hours. Medical inspections became thorough examinations of every corner of the infirmary. His fellow officers began to question his dedication to what they saw as routine bureaucratic tasks. Sister Margaret discovered that her prayers had taken on a different quality. Where once she had prayed for strength to serve God faithfully, now she found herself praying for the wisdom to understand what was happening to her heart. The other sisters noticed her distraction during evening vespers, the way her voice would falter when reciting familiar verses about devotion and purity. Mother Superior Catherine was not blind to these changes. She had shepherded young women through spiritual crises for over 30 years, and she recognized the signs of a soul in turmoil. But the nature of this particular struggle was something she had never encountered before. How does one counsel a sister whose heart has been captured by the enemy? The first words they exchanged came almost by accident. Hans was reviewing patient records when he noticed an entry written in what appeared to be Latin medical terminology. His education at Heidelberg had included classical languages, and he found himself puzzling over a particular phrase. Sister Margaret noticed his confusion and approached quietly. Without thinking, she whispered the translation. Their voices overlapped as they both spoke the same words simultaneously, and they found themselves sharing their first genuine smile since that initial moment of recognition weeks earlier. From that small beginning, their conversations grew like seedlings pushing through concrete. They discovered that Hans spoke fluent French, which provided them with a language that felt less dangerous than her broken German or his limited English. In hushed tones, during brief moments when they found themselves alone, they began to share fragments of their lives before the war. Hans told her about the philosophy classes where he had spent hours discussing the nature of good and evil, never imagining he would one day find himself trapped between the two. He spoke of poetry that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his service, verses by Goethe and Rilke that reminded him of beauty in a world determined to destroy it. Sister Margaret shared her calling to serve, the moment of clarity she had experienced at 19, when she knew with absolute certainty that her life belonged to God. She described the peace she had found in the convent walls, the way prayer had filled the empty spaces in her heart that she hadn't even known existed. But as they talked, both began to realize that their certainties were crumbling. Hans found himself questioning not just the war, but everything he had believed about duty and obedience. Sister Margaret discovered that her devotion to God had not prepared her for this particular test of faith. The danger of their growing connection became apparent when Sergeant Klaus Weber, Hans's second-in-command, began to take notice. Weber was everything that Hans was not. A true believer in the Reich's mission, he viewed the occupied territories as conquered lands to be exploited, not protected. He had been watching his superior's behavior with growing suspicion. One afternoon, Weber arrived at the convent unexpectedly, claiming he needed to conduct his own inspection. His cold eyes swept over the patients and sisters with undisguised contempt. when he saw Hans and Sister Margaret standing near the pharmacy, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation about medical supplies. Something dark flickered across his face. That evening, Weber confronted Hans in their temporary headquarters. The conversation was carefully worded, but the threat was unmistakable. Questions were being asked about Hans's frequent visits to the convent. Some were beginning to wonder if his sympathies lay too heavily with the local population. In wartime, such suspicions could prove fatal. Hans understood the warning perfectly, but instead of pulling back, he found himself driven by a desperate need to protect Sister Margaret from any consequences of their connection. He began to vary his visit patterns, bringing other officers along as witnesses to his professional conduct. But these precautions only served to highlight how precious their private moments had become. Sister Margaret faced her own confrontation when Mother Superior requested a private meeting. The older woman's words were gentle but firm. She had noticed changes in Sister Margaret's behavior, a distraction that was affecting her service to the community. More concerning were the whispered observations from some of the other sisters about her interactions with the German officer. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Sister Margaret's life. How could she explain that she felt more connected to God when she looked into Hans's eyes than she had during any prayer or meditation? How could she describe the way her faith seemed to deepen rather than weaken in his presence, as if he helped her see divine love in a new and more complete way? Mother Superior listened with the patience that came from decades of guiding troubled souls, but her final words carried a weight that Sister Margaret felt like a physical blow. The safety of the entire community depended on maintaining their neutral status with the occupying forces. Any appearance of impropriety could result in the closure of the convent and the end of their mission to heal the wounded. That night, both Hans and Sister Margaret lay awake in their separate quarters, staring into the darkness and grappling with an impossible choice. Their connection had grown beyond mere attraction into something that felt essential to their very existence. Yet, continuing down this path threatened not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they had sworn to protect. The internal struggle that consumed them both was reflected in every interaction. When Hans conducted his inspections, he found himself torn between his duty to maintain professional distance and his overwhelming need to be near her. When Sister Margaret tended to her patients, she discovered that her hands shook slightly whenever she heard his voice in the corridor. Their stolen conversations took on an urgency that bordered on desperation. They began to speak not just of books and philosophy, but of dreams that seemed increasingly impossible. Hans told her about the small farm his family had owned before the war, the way morning mist would rise from the fields like prayers ascending to heaven. Sister Margaret described her vision of a world where healing could happen without the shadow of violence, where love could exist without the burden of shame. But even as they shared these intimate thoughts, both were acutely aware that they were walking along the edge of an abyss. Each moment of connection brought them closer to a point of no return, while each day of war made the consequences of their feelings more dangerous. The weight of their secret began to affect others around them. Hans's military efficiency suffered as his attention wandered during briefings. Sister Margaret's fellow nuns noticed her distraction during communal prayers, the way her voice would trail off when reciting familiar passages about renunciation and sacrifice. The tension reached a breaking point when news arrived of increased partisan activity in the region. German High Command was demanding stricter security measures, more frequent inspections, and closer monitoring of all civilian institutions. The relative freedom that had allowed Hans and Sister Margaret's relationship to develop was about to be severely curtailed. As winter approached, both realized they were facing a crisis that would force them to choose between their growing love and everything else they held sacred. The question was no longer whether they could continue as they had been, but whether they would have the courage to face the consequences of the feelings they could no longer deny. The first snow of winter arrived early that year, blanketing the convent grounds in a deceptive purity that seemed to mock the complexity of human emotion brewing beneath its surface. Sister Margaret stood at her small window, watching the flakes drift past like fallen prayers when she heard the familiar sound of German vehicles approaching through the silence. But this time was different. The convoy was larger, more official. Black sedans accompanied the usual military trucks, and when the doors opened, officers emerged wearing insignia that Sister Margaret had learned to fear. This was not Hans's routine inspection. This was something far more dangerous. Hans stepped out of the lead vehicle, his face a mask of professional composure that Sister Margaret had learned to read like scripture. The tightness around his eyes, the way his shoulders held tension, the careful blankness of his expression. All of it told her that their carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Oberst Heinrich Richter had arrived without warning, bringing with him the full weight of German military authority. A man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes like winter steel, Richter represented everything that Hans despised about the regime he served. Where Hans sought to minimize harm, Richter embraced it as necessary. Where Hans questioned orders, Richter followed them with zealous efficiency. The inspection began with mechanical precision. Every room was searched, every document examined, every sister questioned about their activities and associations. Sister Margaret moved through her duties with practiced calm, but her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Richter's cold gaze sweep over their sacred space like a predator, marking territory. Hans maintained his professional distance, but Sister Margaret caught the subtle signals he sent her. A slight shake of his head when she moved to approach him. A warning glance when Richter's attention turned their way. The man she had grown to love was trying desperately to protect her, even as his own position grew more precarious by the hour. The crisis erupted during the afternoon inspection of patient records. Richter had been studying the admission logs with suspicious intensity when he discovered something that made his eyes narrow with dangerous interest. A pattern of German soldiers receiving preferential treatment, longer recovery times, more thorough medical attention than regulations typically allowed. Sister Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what Richter was seeing. In their compassion for the wounded, the sisters had indeed provided care that went beyond basic medical requirements. But now, under Richter's merciless scrutiny, their acts of mercy looked like potential collaboration with the enemy. The interrogation that followed was conducted with the cold efficiency of a military tribunal. Mother Superior Catherine faced Richter's questions with dignified composure, explaining that their Christian duty demanded they treat all patients with equal compassion. But Richter was not interested in theological justifications. Hans found himself caught between his duty to his superior and his desperate need to protect the community that had shown him unexpected kindness. When Richter questioned him about his frequent visits to the convent, Hans provided carefully worded explanations about security concerns and supply management. But he could see the suspicion growing in Richter's eyes like frost spreading across glass. The most dangerous moment came when Richter demanded to speak privately with Sister Margaret. Hans felt his stomach clench as he watched her follow the Oberst into Mother Superior's office, her spine straight with courage that both inspired and terrified him. For 20 minutes, that felt like centuries. He waited outside that closed door, knowing that everything they had built together hung in the balance. Inside the office, Sister Margaret faced questions that seemed designed to trap her in contradictions. Richter's voice was silk wrapped around steel as he asked about her interactions with German personnel, her knowledge of military procedures, her observations about officer behavior. Each question felt like a blade probing for weakness. But Sister Margaret had been trained in a different kind of warfare. Years of prayer and service had taught her to find strength in surrender, power in humility. She answered each question with simple honesty, never volunteering information but never lying outright. Her faith became her armor, protecting not just herself but the man she had come to love. When the interrogation finally ended, Richter emerged from the office with an expression that revealed nothing. Sister Margaret followed moments later, her face pale but composed. The brief glance she shared with Hans across the crowded corridor carried volumes of unspoken communication. They had survived this encounter, but both understood that their reprieve was temporary. That evening, as the German convoy prepared to depart, Hans managed to create a moment of privacy with Sister Margaret in the chapel. The ancient stone walls seemed to absorb their whispered words as he explained the gravity of their situation. Richter suspected something, though he couldn't yet prove it. Hans would be watched more closely now, his every action scrutinized for signs of disloyalty. Sister Margaret listened with the same intensity she brought to prayer, understanding that this might be their last private conversation for weeks or even months. When Hans finished speaking, she reached into her habit and withdrew something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a small wooden cross, carved with intricate detail by some long-dead artisan. She had worn it since taking her vows, a tangible reminder of her commitment to God. But now she pressed it into Hans's palm, her fingers lingering against his skin for just a moment longer than safety allowed. The gift carried multiple meanings that both of them understood without words. It was a token of her affection, a prayer for his protection, and perhaps, most importantly, a symbol of the faith that had brought them together despite every obstacle the world had placed in their path. Hans closed his fingers around the cross, feeling its worn edges bite into his palm. He wanted to give her something in return, some token that would remind her of what they had shared during these impossible weeks. But he had nothing to offer except the promise that lived in his eyes, the silent vow that somehow, someday, they would find a way to be together. The sound of engines starting in the courtyard reminded them that time had run out. Hans tucked the cross inside his uniform jacket, where it would rest against his heart like a secret prayer. Sister Margaret stepped back, her hands folded in the traditional posture of devotion, but her eyes remained fixed on his face as if memorizing every detail. Their goodbye was conducted in silence, surrounded by the ancient stones that had witnessed countless human dramas over the centuries. But the weight of unspoken words filled the space between them, promises and fears and desperate hopes that neither dared voice aloud. As Hans walked away, his footsteps echoing through the chapel, Sister Margaret remained kneeling before the altar. But her prayers that night were unlike any she had offered before. She prayed not for strength to resist temptation, but for wisdom to understand what God wanted from her heart. She prayed not for the destruction of her feelings, but for the courage to follow them wherever they might lead. The weeks that followed Hans's departure were filled with a different kind of tension than Sister Margaret had ever experienced. The convent continued its work of healing and prayer, but everything felt changed, as if the very air had been charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Letters began arriving with increasing frequency, official communications that Mother Superior read with growing concern. The German High Command was implementing new security measures throughout the occupied territories. Random inspections would become more common. Collaboration with local resistance movements would be punished with extreme severity, and any signs of fraternization between German personnel and French civilians would result in immediate consequences. Sister Margaret threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, tending to patients with a fierce dedication that both impressed and worried her fellow sisters. She rose before dawn for private prayers, stayed late in the infirmary organizing supplies, and volunteered for the most difficult nursing duties. But those who knew her well could see that her frantic activity was a way of avoiding the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her during quiet moments. The wooden cross that Hans carried with him became both his salvation and his torment. During long nights in temporary barracks, he would hold it in his palm and remember the weight of Sister Margaret's hand against his own. The simple piece of carved wood connected him to something pure and beautiful in a world that seemed determined to destroy both qualities. But the cross also served as a constant reminder of the impossible nature of their situation. Every time he felt its familiar weight against his chest, Hans was forced to confront the fundamental contradiction of his existence. How could he serve an army that represented everything Sister Margaret's faith opposed. How could he claim to love her while wearing the uniform of her people's oppressors? The answer came to him gradually, like dawn breaking over a battlefield. He could not change the past or immediately escape the present, but he could begin to make choices that honored the love they had discovered together. Small acts of mercy that his position allowed, moments of protection for the innocent, decisions that preserved life rather than destroyed it. Hans began to use his authority in ways that would have surprised his superiors. Supply convoys bound for the convent arrived with extra medical supplies that had somehow been misplaced from other shipments. Security patrols in the area developed a pattern of focusing their attention away from locations where resistance activity might be suspected. German soldiers under his command found themselves assigned to duties that kept them away from situations where they might be ordered to harm civilians. These acts of quiet rebellion were dangerous, but they gave Hans a sense of purpose that had been missing since the war began. Each small mercy felt like a prayer offered in Sister Margaret's honor, a way of proving to himself that love could exist even within systems designed to crush it. Meanwhile, at the convent, Sister Margaret was undergoing her own transformation. The feelings that Hans had awakened in her heart were not diminishing with time and distance, as she had hoped they might. Instead, they were deepening into something that challenged every assumption she had made about the nature of divine love. She began to see connections between her love for Hans and her love for God that she had never noticed before. The way her heart opened when she thought of him, the desire to sacrifice everything for his well-being, the sense of being completed by another's presence. These emotions felt not like a betrayal of her religious vows, but like a deeper understanding of what those vows truly meant. During her private prayers, Sister Margaret found herself having conversations with God that would have scandalized more traditional believers. She spoke honestly about her feelings, asking not for their removal, but for guidance in understanding their purpose. She prayed for Hans's safety with the same intensity she had once reserved for the salvation of souls. She asked for wisdom to know whether love could be a form of worship, whether the heart's deepest longings might sometimes be heaven's whispered instructions. The answer to her prayers came not through mystical revelation, but through the daily work of caring for the wounded. As she tended to soldiers from both sides of the conflict, Sister Margaret began to see that love was not something to be rationed or controlled, but something to be offered freely to all who suffered. Her feelings for Hans had not diminished her capacity for compassion. Instead, they had expanded it beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. This realization brought both peace and terror. If love was indeed a reflection of divine grace, then her feelings for Hans might be not sinful, but sacred. But if that were true, then the structures and rules that had governed her life for 7 years might be far more flexible than she had ever dared to believe. The implications of this spiritual revolution were staggering. Sister Margaret found herself questioning not just her individual vows, but the entire system of religious life that had shaped her identity. Was it possible to serve God outside the convent walls? Could love for one person coexist with love for all humanity? Was there a way to honor both her calling to heal and her calling to Hans's heart? These questions consumed her thoughts as winter deepened around the convent. Snow continued to fall, creating a world of pristine beauty that seemed to exist in a different universe from the one torn apart by war. But Sister Margaret was learning that beauty and horror could coexist just as love and duty could intertwine in ways that defied simple categorization. The test of her new understanding came when wounded German soldiers began arriving at the convent in increasing numbers. The winter offensive had been brutal, leaving hundreds of men broken and dying far from home. Among them was a young private named Eric, barely 18 years old, who had been caught in an artillery barrage that left him blind and delirious with pain. As Sister Margaret tended to Eric's wounds, she saw something that made her heart contract with recognition. The boy's features reminded her strongly of Hans, the same strong jawline and sensitive mouth, the same way of holding his head even in unconsciousness. For a moment, she imagined that this could be Hans lying here, broken and calling for someone who might never come. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her love for Hans had not made her less capable of loving others. It had made her more aware of how precious every human life truly was. Each wounded soldier became someone's beloved, someone's Hans, someone whose absence would leave a hole in another heart that could never be fully healed. This understanding transformed her nursing care from professional duty into something approaching worship. She began to see the face of divine love in every person she tended, to recognize the sacred nature of the vulnerability that illness and injury created. Her hands, guided by both medical training and spiritual insight, became instruments of healing that went beyond the merely physical. Word of Sister Margaret's extraordinary care began to spread among the German troops stationed in the region. Soldiers who had been treated at the convent spoke of the young nun whose very presence seemed to ease suffering, whose touch carried a power that went beyond normal medical skill. These stories eventually reached the ears of officers who began to wonder if there was something more than professional competence at work. Hans heard these reports during a briefing about civilian medical facilities in the sector. As his commanding officer described the exceptional care being provided at the convent of St. Catherine, Hans felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. Sister Margaret's reputation for healing was growing, which meant she was becoming more visible to military authorities who might decide to investigate the source of her remarkable abilities. The irony was not lost on him. The love they shared had awakened something extraordinary in Sister Margaret, a capacity for healing that was becoming legendary among the troops. But that same gift was now drawing attention that could ultimately destroy them both. Love had made her more powerful and more vulnerable simultaneously. As winter began its slow retreat toward spring, both Hans and Sister Margaret were coming to understand that their situation was reaching a crisis point that could no longer be avoided or postponed. The love they had discovered was not something that could be contained within the boundaries of stolen glances and whispered conversations. It was growing into something that would eventually demand a choice between the lives they had built and the life they might create together. The question was no longer whether they would have to decide between love and duty, but whether they would have the courage to face the consequences of whatever choice they made. The spring of 1944 was approaching, and with it would come changes that would test everything they believed about sacrifice, devotion, and the price of following their hearts into unknown territory. Territory. Spring arrived at the convent of St. Catherine like a whispered promise, bringing with it changes that neither Hans nor Sister Margaret could have anticipated. The harsh winter had given way to tentative green shoots pushing through the earth, but the season of renewal would bring trials that would test the very foundations of everything they had built together. The first sign of impending upheaval came through official channels that made Mother Superior's hands tremble as she read the dispatched orders. The German High Command had decided to consolidate medical facilities throughout the region, centralizing wounded personnel in larger, more easily monitored installations. The small convent that had served as a sanctuary for the injured was to be reassigned to different purposes entirely. Sister Margaret received this news during morning prayers, watching as Mother Superior's composed expression cracked just enough to reveal the fear beneath. The implications were immediate and devastating. Not only would their mission of healing come to an end, but the fragile ecosystem that had allowed her connection with Hans to flourish was about to be dismantled completely. Hans learned of the reorganization through military briefings that outlined new strategic priorities for the spring offensive. His heart sank as he realized what this meant for their carefully maintained world of stolen moments and whispered conversations. The bureaucratic language of military efficiency could not hide the personal catastrophe that these changes represented. But fate, it seemed, had other plans entirely. 3 days before the scheduled closure of the medical facility, a massive Allied bombing raid struck German supply lines throughout the region. The attack created chaos that rippled through every level of military organization, forcing commanders to adapt their plans in ways that no one could have predicted. Suddenly, the small convent found itself more essential than ever. With larger medical facilities damaged or destroyed, the sisters' modest infirmary became a crucial link in the chain of emergency care. Instead of closing, they were ordered to expand their operations to prepare for an influx of casualties that would stretch their resources beyond anything they had previously experienced. Hans found himself assigned as the primary liaison officer for this expanded operation, a posting that would require him to spend extended periods at the convent, supervising the integration of military medical personnel with the existing religious community. The official justification was his familiarity with the facility and its operations. The reality was an opportunity for extended contact that neither he nor Sister Margaret had dared to hope for. The expanded medical operation brought new challenges that tested everyone's limits. Military doctors arrived with equipment and procedures that transformed the peaceful convent into something resembling a field hospital. The ancient stone walls echoed with sounds they had never contained before. The mechanical hum of generators, the urgent voices of surgical teams, the constant movement of stretchers carrying the wounded. Sister Margaret found herself working 18-hour shifts, her medical training pushed to its absolute limits as she assisted with procedures that would have been unthinkable in the convent's previous incarnation. Blood stained her habit despite her best efforts to remain clean, and exhaustion became her constant companion. But, through it all, she maintained the serene competence that had made her legendary among the German troops. Hans discovered that his new responsibilities required him to make decisions that would have been impossible in his previous postings. Questions of resource allocation, personnel management, and medical priorities fell to him in ways that allowed him to exercise the compassion that Sister Margaret had awakened in his heart. Every choice became an opportunity to preserve life rather than destroy it. Their work brought them into closer contact than they had ever experienced before. Military efficiency demanded constant communication between the liaison officer and the senior nursing staff. Official duties required them to spend hours together reviewing patient lists, supply requirements, and operational procedures. But beneath these professional interactions ran an undercurrent of emotional intensity that threatened to overwhelm them both. The proximity was both a blessing and a torment. They could speak freely about medical matters, their conversations protected by the urgent necessity of their shared work. But every exchange carried layers of meaning that had nothing to do with bandages or medications. When Hans asked about patient recovery rates, Sister Margaret heard concern for human suffering that went beyond military statistics. When she reported on supply shortages, he understood her frustration at being unable to provide perfect care for every person who needed it. Their colleagues began to notice the seamless efficiency with which they worked together. Other officers commented on Hans's unusual dedication to what many considered tedious administrative work. Fellow sisters observed Sister Margaret's renewed energy despite the crushing workload, the way she seemed to find reserves of strength that surprised even herself. But it was during the night shifts that their relationship deepened into something that neither could deny or ignore any longer. The convent took on a different character after dark when the urgent bustle of daytime medical activity gave way to the quieter rhythms of monitoring and care. Patients slept fitfully, their dreams haunted by memories of battle, while skeleton crews of medical personnel maintained vigilant watch. Hans often found reasons to conduct security rounds during these quiet hours, his footsteps echoing through corridors lit only by flickering candles and the occasional electric bulb. Sister Margaret worked the night rotation by choice, claiming that her patients needed the continuity of familiar care during their most vulnerable hours. But they both understood the real reason for their nocturnal schedules. It was during one of these night shifts that they finally spoke the words that had been building between them for months. A young German soldier, barely older than a child, had died despite their best efforts to save him. Sister Margaret knelt beside his bed, her tears falling freely as she whispered prayers for his soul, when Hans appeared in the doorway. Without hesitation, he crossed the room and knelt beside her, his own grief evident in the way his shoulders shook with barely controlled emotion. For several minutes they knelt together in silence, mourning not just this one young life, but all the lives that war had claimed and would continue to claim. When Sister Margaret finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She told him about her prayers, about the way her understanding of divine love had changed since meeting him, about the confusion and clarity that fought for control of her heart. Hans listened with the intensity of a man hearing his own thoughts spoken aloud, recognizing in her words the same spiritual struggle that had been tearing him apart. His response came haltingly, as if each word had to be pulled from some deep place within himself that he had kept locked away. He spoke of the man he had been before the war, the dreams that military service had shattered, the way her presence had awakened parts of himself he thought had died in the trenches. He told her about the wooden cross she had given him, how it had become both anchor and compass in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything beautiful. They talked through the remainder of that night, their conversation flowing like water finding its natural course after being dammed for too long. They spoke of books they had read, places they had dreamed of visiting, the kind of life they might have built together if the world had been different. But underneath all these surface topics ran a deeper current of recognition, an acknowledgement that they had found in each other something worth any sacrifice. As dawn approached, bringing with it the return of daytime routines and public responsibilities, they both understood that everything had changed. The words spoken in that quiet room, witnessed only by ancient stone walls and the memory of a young soldier's final breath, had transformed them from two people fighting attraction into two souls committed to each other regardless of consequences. The days that followed were charged with new energy that both exhilarated and terrified them. Their professional interactions took on an efficiency that bordered on telepathic, each anticipating the other's needs and responses with uncanny accuracy. But beneath this smooth collaboration ran an undercurrent of barely contained passion that threatened to surface at any unguarded moment. Sister Margaret found herself stealing glances at Hans during medical briefings, memorizing the way concentration furrowed his brow or how he unconsciously touched the cross beneath his uniform when making difficult decisions. Hans discovered that he could locate Sister Margaret anywhere in the convent simply by following the sound of her voice or the particular rhythm of her footsteps on stone floors. The other sisters began to whisper among themselves about the change in Sister Margaret's demeanor. She moved through her duties with a lightness that seemed to defy the crushing weight of their workload. Her smile, always gentle, now carried a luminescence that drew patients like moths to flame. Even her prayers seemed different, infused with a joy that transformed familiar words into something approaching song. Hans's fellow officers noted similar changes in his behavior. The bitter cynicism that had marked his service since conscription began to fade, replaced by an engagement with his duties that surprised everyone who knew him. His decisions became more decisive, his leadership more inspiring, his concern for the welfare of both German personnel and French civilians more pronounced. But with increased visibility came increased danger. Sergeant Weber's suspicions, temporarily quieted by Richter's earlier investigation, began to resurface with renewed intensity. He started making unexpected visits to the convent, ostensibly to check on security protocols, but actually to observe the interactions between his superior and the French nun, who seemed to command such unusual attention. The crisis Weber had been building toward erupted on a morning when spring rain drummed against the convent windows like impatient fingers. A convoy of severely wounded soldiers had arrived during the night, overwhelming the facility's capacity and requiring every available person to work beyond their normal limits. In the chaos of triage and emergency surgery, Hans and Sister Margaret found themselves working side by side with an intimacy that their professional relationship could no longer adequately explain. Weber arrived just as they were emerging from a particularly difficult procedure, their faces flushed with exhaustion and their hands stained with the blood of a young man they had managed to save through combined efforts. The sight that greeted Weber's calculating eyes was unmistakable. Two people who had moved beyond professional cooperation into something that looked dangerously like partnership. The confrontation that followed was conducted in the sterile language of military protocol, but its implications were crystal clear. Weber raised questions about operational security, about the appropriate boundaries between German personnel and French civilians, about the need to maintain proper military discipline even in medical settings. His words were carefully chosen to avoid direct accusations while making his suspicions absolutely clear. Hans responded with the calm authority of superior rank, but Sister Margaret could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. She understood that they had crossed a line from which there might be no return, that their love had become visible to eyes trained to detect exactly this kind of vulnerability. That evening, as the last of the emergency patients were stabilized and the convent settled into its nighttime rhythms, Hans and Sister Margaret met in the chapel for what they both understood might be their final private conversation. The ancient stones seemed to absorb their whispered words as they grappled with the impossible choice that now confronted them. They could continue as they had been, knowing that Weber's suspicions would only grow stronger and more dangerous with time. They could attempt to return to their previous professional distance, though both doubted their ability to maintain such pretense after everything they had shared, or they could acknowledge that their love had grown beyond the boundaries of their current lives and take whatever action that recognition demanded. The conversation that followed was unlike any either had ever experienced. They spoke not just as individuals wrestling with personal desires, but as souls trying to discern the will of something greater than themselves. Sister Margaret found herself questioning whether God's plan for her life might include possibilities she had never considered. Hans wondered if the love he felt might be not a distraction from his duty to humanity, but the very thing that could guide him toward fulfilling that duty more completely. As they talked through the night, surrounded by the weight of centuries and the presence of something sacred that neither could name, but both could feel, they began to understand that their choice was not between love and duty, but between different ways of serving the highest calling they could imagine. The question was not whether they would choose each other, but how they would honor both their love and their commitment to healing a world torn apart by hatred. The decision they reached before dawn would change not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who depended on the sanctuary they had helped to create. The spring of 1944 was about to become the season when two hearts would either find the courage to claim their destiny or discover that some loves are too dangerous for the world to allow. This story of Sister Margaret and Hans Miller reveals something profound about the nature of love in our darkest hours. Through artificial intelligence, we've witnessed how two souls found each other across the impossible divide of war, faith, and duty. Their forbidden romance reminds us that even in humanity's bleakest moments, love finds a way to bloom in the shadows. What makes their story so compelling is not just the drama of their circumstances, but the universal truth it illuminates. We all face moments when our hearts collide with the expectations of the world around us. We all must choose between the safe path and the one that leads toward authentic connection with another human being. The genius of this AI-generated narrative lies in how it captures the authentic emotional weight of such impossible choices. Every stolen glance, every whispered conversation, every moment of agonizing decision reflects the real experiences of countless individuals who lived through similar struggles during World War II. Sister Margaret and Hans discovered that love is not always about happy endings. Sometimes it's about finding the courage to honor what your heart knows to be true, even when the world demands that you deny it. Their story teaches us that the greatest acts of faith sometimes require us to step outside the boundaries others have drawn around our lives. As we close this chapter of their story, we're left with questions that echo across time. What would you do if love demanded that you choose between everything you've been taught to value and everything your heart tells you is sacred? How do you honor both duty and desire when they seem to pull you in opposite directions? The spring of 1944 brought changes that would test every assumption Sister Margaret and Hans had made about their lives. But perhaps that's what love is meant to do. Perhaps it's meant to challenge us to become larger versions of ourselves, to find courage we didn't know we possessed, to discover that the heart's deepest longings might sometimes be heaven's whispered instructions. Their story continues to unfold in ways that will surprise and devastate you. If you want to discover what choice they ultimately made, what sacrifices love demanded, and whether their forbidden romance could survive in a world determined to destroy it, you need to watch the next episode in this series, because some love stories are too powerful to be contained in a single telling, and Sister Margaret and Hans Muller's journey into the unknown has only just begun.